Okay, welcome back. So now that we've discussed or reintroduced popular culture, we can introduce the media. So you probably just by existing in the world and having a critical mind already have some thoughts and opinions on the media. But I think it's very helpful to be clear about what exactly we mean by the media. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about media? And you know, then we can ask questions like who's controlling the media narrative? What's the kind of history of the media and what's brought us to the forms of media that we have today? How do we understand the forms of media we have today and the really rapid ways in which they're changing? So those are some of the things that I'm going to speak to you about now. But to start with, let's define what exactly it is that we're talking about when we're talking about the media. So essentially, media are technologically developed forms of human communication that mediate reality for us. So this can be things like print media, newspapers, all the way through to television, screen media, and online media, social media. So the concept of media is incredibly broad and spans a very wide range of technologies, and we can look at the implications of each of these technologies as well as some of the things that they have in common. And so the concept of the media includes both the media industries, so the big kind of media companies such as Fox News would be an example I'm sure we're all familiar with, for better or worse. And it also includes the actual technologies that we're using. So the forms, the kind of mediums that we're using to convey media across time and space. So things like a newspaper all the way through to web pages. And these are mediums for conveying information, for getting information from the sender to the receiver, whether that happens very quickly in the case of a website, so quickly that there's now the capacity to interact with the media on news sites by leaving comments and such, rather than writing in a letter to the editor and seeing it perhaps a week later in print media. So as I was saying, media are essentially a kind of medium that in many ways mediate between us and reality. So they are a source of information, but they're also very much a kind of intermediary between us and the information. So I think we can all agree that media are not really neutral. They're not a neutral product. They're something that provides us with information, but also by looking at that information, by viewing the world through the lens of this media, they shape the way in which we see the information that they're giving us. They're not a neutral entity as such. So I think it's really interesting to consider the fact that media is so pervasive that we often have trouble distinguishing between things that we've experienced directly and things that we've heard on the radio, read in a newspaper, seen on television, absorbed from the internet. That becomes very much our reality. It becomes very direct to our own everyday experiences and what we know about the world, which I think has pretty powerful implications, especially when we're considering that the media are clearly not neutral. They are, a medium for conveying information, but they also mediate. They are a kind of lens through which we see the world, and they're, a source of information that often has a lot of control of the narrative around that information. So in other words, we often kind of fail to consider the power of the media to influence how we see the world, how we engage with each other, and this is where sociology of the media comes in. This is where it's incredibly useful. It helps us to ask critical questions about the media. And the biggest question that I'd like to put to you to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this lecture and as you go to your tutorials this week is the question of whether the media reflect reality or shape reality. Do you think that they reflect what's happening in the world, or do you think that they actively shape what's happening in the world? So this is really a question of whether the degree to which media are reacting and just conveying information, or whether they are actively kind of controlling the narrative around information. So I think this is a really, really important question, especially as we move on to the next part of the lecture to discussing media effects. So that probably gives you some idea of why sociologists study the media, but just to expand on that, media products are obviously incredibly central to our everyday lives, our experiences day to day, and they provide us a lot of different things. They provide entertainment. They're a source for accessing popular culture, which, as I discussed in the previous part of the lecture, is something that is so central to our everyday lives and our personal identities, the ways in which we relate to each other. And they're also a great source of information. So I would assume that the vast majority of us were accessing information and are continuing to access information about what we are and are not allowed to do at present, how many friends we can have over to our house tonight, and when things are going to be open, and when it's safe to do certain things, and whether we can go and rejoin boot camps in the park for whoever actually does that. So anyway, I would assume that the vast majority of us are gaining information about that from the media. And so that's pretty powerful. If we're all looking to the media as that source of information, a really key sociological question is, what is the significance of this? What does it mean that that's our source of information? How does that impact how we're relating to that information, how we understand things, how we're relating to the general context we're living in, how we think of the pandemic, how we think of the particular lockdown policies and restrictions, whether we see them as this great thing that's keeping us safe or this really oppressive force that's way over the top and destroying the economy and all of those sorts of things. That's shaped by many things, but one of them is arguably media narratives. And so that's a really important area for sociologists to be looking at. And the media is also of interest to sociologists because it's a major, major source of employment. So if we're looking at the sociology of work, organizational sociology, then the media is a very significant area to focus on there, especially because the media are in many ways at the forefront of new kinds of working arrangements. The media have had people who are working in freelance capacity for a very long time, and new types of working arrangements and different types of working arrangements are really of a lot of interest for sociologists, especially those that are concerned with industrial relations and workers' conditions. Media is also related to the first point, of great interest to sociologists because the media is a kind of powerful agent of socialization. So if you think back to what we covered back in week 1 of this course, if you can cast your mind back there, remember talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary forms of socialization. And so the media is a powerful, powerful form of secondary and tertiary socialization. The media socializes us into certain forms of knowledge, certain customs, certain values and assumptions, all the way through our lives. The media is something we come into contact with early and continue to have contact with. But then the media are also very important sites of creativity, of expression, of artistic endeavor. So they're interesting from that kind of affective perspective as well. So as you can see, there's a lot to unpack for sociologists within the media. And that's why it's a topic in this week of the course, or a topic in the course more generally, because it is a huge, huge area of study for sociologists. And it's, something you might be interested in looking at further in your kind of later studies. So in order to understand the significance of the media and the ways in which it's developed, I think it's very helpful to return to the media in the past and look at how our current media landscape has come about. So arguably the first forms of media are cave paintings that were used to convey information by hunter-gatherers in Europe and here in Australia. And then as time moved on a bit, we have different types of media developing. So in 3500 BC, we have pictographs. We have Egyptians using papyrus paper to record and share information. We have the Chinese inventing paper as we know it, or probably not quite as we know it, in the 150th century AD. And then by the 12th century AD, we have paper produced in Europe. And then the really kind of watershed moment for the media was the invention of the Gutenberg press in Germany in the 1440s. So Johann Gutenberg essentially converted a wine press, of all things, to produce the first kind of press that could press ink onto paper, essentially, and it'd be a fast and reliable way of creating the written word, creating written pages in a standardized form. And so the first book that was created in that way was the Bible. And then flash forward to 1702, we have the first daily newspaper that was published in Britain. And the early newspapers, especially from Britain, are particularly interesting because a lot of them have not been digitized until very, very recently. They've only been stored in ways that are a bit harder to access. And so recently, some of the very old British newspaper archives have been digitized, and now those digital files are available to historians working all over the world. So there's been quite a boom in kind of history of the media in the last 5 or so years. So that's a particular space to be watching and a particular space of interest. So this is a picture of the Gutenberg press. And we can see here the actual press itself. So this particular printing press really absolutely revolutionized the way in which information, in the written word especially, could be conveyed. Prior to this, there were ways of essentially printing information, printing the written word onto pages, but they were much less systematized, much harder to do. They could only, using these processes, you could only really print a couple of hundred pages a day, whereas the Gutenberg press could print, I think, upwards of 3,000 pages a day. This is amazing, especially compared to back at this time, people were still kind of hand copying books to have handwriting books in cursive to have new copies of books. So this really was a very, very important step in bringing the printed word to the masses. And at this particular time, having a printing press, having a systematized way of writing letters, a systematized way, in many cases, or increasingly systematized, of spelling words was really, really significant. We didn't necessarily have this before, like, the mass production of written words was possible. So anyway, if we flash forward to media today, we can distinguish between a few different types of media. So the first one is mass media versus niche media. So mass media are generally forms of media that are, as the term might suggest, used to communicate to the masses. So we can think of national newspapers, global news, even kind of national news services. So those that are just for the general public. Whereas in contrast, niche media have a smaller audience. They might be marketed towards a particular subculture. Perhaps they are only for people interested in surfing, people interested in skateboarding, people interested in the local Newcastle music scene, or anything like that. So mass media is very large in its scale and its scope, whereas niche media is much smaller in its reach. So their impact is really different. And we're going to be focusing predominantly today on mass media. And we can also distinguish between old and new media. So old media are books, newspapers, films, radio, and even television. So things that your parents were using to access media and access information. Whereas new media are these new technologies that have come about in the so-called digital age. So the internet, mobile phones, digital media, computer software, especially social networking platforms, things like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all of these new forms of social media. But then these old and new forms of media are not necessarily completely separate. They've come about at different points of time, but media convergence theory is essentially refers to the ways in which the differences between these old and new forms of media are disappearing. They're coming together, and increasingly we have phones that have cameras embedded in them, or internet radio, or podcasts available on the internet. So essentially, these old forms of media are not necessarily disappearing. They're instead converging with new forms of media to create our contemporary mass media landscape. So an example of this would be the way in which newspapers do still, some of them at least, have a print run, but they're also available online on the basis of subscription. So they've used their existing kind of models and put that online to try to keep up with the way in which the media and information are now operating. So the media, especially in contemporary times, is particularly interesting because, due to this type of convergence, due to more and more media moving into digital spaces, we have the ability to access media incredibly quickly. So if we think back to the week on globalization, in which I spoke to you about David Harvey, the critical geographer, who's talking about the way in which we're witnessing time-space compression, the way in which the planet is essentially shrinking because we are able to cover distance and transmit information so incredibly quickly. We can see the media is a fantastic example of this. Something will happen, and then the media will report on it almost instantaneously. And this is traditional media in terms of mass media-owned companies, but it's also commentators and such on social media. So I think a wonderful a wonderful and very pertinent example of this is the fact that the current president of the United States is very much kind of instantly responding to the media and instantly creating his own news stories. So while presidents have conventionally had kind of media like press conferences and such, and had organized preset times to deliver what we would assume would be very very rehearsed and tried and true statements about things, we suddenly have, through the power of social media, a US president who is essentially commentating in real time on the news itself, but also on many different developments and such. So this kind of instantaneous media, it has a number of consequences. Some of these are very much the fact that we have instant news. We have a constant news cycle. So it's no longer that we receive a newspaper once a day and then put that out of our mind. We have constant breaking news stories. We can keep scrolling forever if you're on Twitter and you like to procrastinate like I do. We also have, essentially because of the immediacy of news, because it is produced so incredibly quickly, we also have the proliferation of what we can call fake news or false news, in which stories are reported before they can be verified, and the standards of essentially media and journalistic kind of credibility and validity have changed somewhat, because there's an expectation that news will be available incredibly quickly, especially when we're moving away from traditional media platforms to things like social media, where anyone can be posting information and can go viral. The quality and validity of information is increasingly something that we can call into question, which in of itself has quite overt ramifications for us. So essentially the kind of changes in the media are only as relevant sociologically as they are because of the kind of degree of power that the media has. So the modern media essentially shapes the way that we relate to the social world. It can shape our social relations, and it essentially has a lot of control over the information that we receive and the way in which we receive this information. So as mentioning, when I was defining what exactly is meant by the media mediates the way in which we access information, and it can in many ways control the information that we do access. So it can establish what is true, what isn't true. And this becomes quite tricky in contexts where we don't have complete certainty about the quality of media or the validity of a certain kind of media take. So if we search through online media, we can find all sorts of things. We can find social media and websites dedicated to things like alien abductions and lizard people and Pete Evans and all of these different things. So really, I think the power of the media can't really be overstated, especially in its current form, in which we have an incredibly fast media cycle, and we often don't have ways to verify the quality and validity of the information that we're receiving. So we can now return to some of the main conceptual perspectives that we've introduced in this course. So we can consider how the media can be viewed through these perspectives. So we can start with functionalism. So essentially, functionalist theories in the 20th century emphasized the socializing role that the media fulfilled. So they emphasized the way in which the media provides a means of learning, essentially, about how to behave in society, how we should interact, and how we can all live together and ensure that we have a smooth kind of social system overall. And so according to this view, essentially within liberal democracies, media should operate as kind of guardians or watchdogs of the citizenry. So protecting the interests of citizens, attempting to maintain a consensus on values or maintain a kind of certain type of social equilibrium, and should thus try to avoid encouraging deviance or disrupting the social order too much. So essentially, this type of view of media is related to the sociological concept of the public sphere, which refers to a kind of a forum for debate or for the creation of an informed citizenry in which people can come together and debate the issues of the day and ideally reach consensus. So essentially, a functionalist view of the media views it as an agent for socialization and a way to maintain the functioning of the overall social system. And this, as you might assume, is very, very different to what we can call a conflict or Marxist view of the media. So especially Marxist theorists of the media understand the media as essentially a kind of apparatus for cultural domination. So a means through which members of a ruling class would achieve cultural domination and economic exploitation of members of the working class. So this is essentially by using the media to not only kind of control the narrative around things, but control essentially resources and control essentially wages that were available. And so in this view, the media would kind of aid the oppression of the working class by avoiding analysis and criticism of the so-called ruling class, and by essentially not only avoiding this type of analysis, but by distracting members of the working class, ensuring that they did not rise up and challenge those that kind of set the rules of the game and were benefiting from their exploitation. So in this way, the media kind of keeps people in line and keeps people operating within a system which does not necessarily benefit them. So interestingly, within a functionalist view versus a conflict view of the media, the result is quite similar. The media is socializing people into being part of a productive social order, but the kind of system or kind of process behind this is viewed in quite different ways through each of these perspectives. So the NeoMarxist view of the media is kind of, I think, quite interesting to focus on. A neo-Marxist view would argue that the media essentially maintain and neutralize the kind of status quo through a number of different mechanisms. So the first one would be the perpetuating an ideology of meritocracy. So, for instance, the idea that everyone can be a celebrity if they do these certain things, or there's kind of opportunities for everyone to be a celebrity if they work really hard. And there's also the use of kind of cult of celebrity for escapism and for just the pleasure of voyeurism. there's also a very strong focus on consumerism, which essentially would argue that the commercial media only really exists to sell things to the audience. So those that consume the media are essentially, a captive audience for advertisers. Then there's also within, if we're viewing the media as an ideological kind of apparatus for achieving domination, there's the ways in which the media arguably perpetuate existing forms of inequality or spaces in which inequality is conventionally entrenched. So we can see many examples of racism in the media. We can see the stigmatization of working class people and other kind of forms of marginality. And we can definitely see a lot of examples of sexism in the media, which I think we could have a whole lecture on. So that's really something that is very, very pervasive. So I think gender in the media is something particularly relevant to talk about. So essentially, if we think of the media, as an agent for socialization in the way that's suggested by really both functionalist and critical perspectives on the media, then we can look at the way in which it's socializing us into very limiting ideas about gender and how gender is represented, how you fulfill expectations related to gender. So some typical messages that are conveyed through the media are around how you should look, the ideas about who is doing household labor. If you look at especially advertisements and television shows and such around, who is actually doing the cleaning, who are cleaning products and, childcare, like products generally for children actually being marketed to. It's almost always women and mothers. We can also look at the naturalization of sexualization and objectification of women, and the stereotypes about men as well. The stereotypes of men as either strong and brave or as the kind of Homer Simpson butt of the joke. So we can see that, in most contemporary media, men are either the heroes who are saving something or another, or they're villains to be competed with. So there's really very limiting stereotypes for both men and women through the kind of the way in which contemporary media represents gender, really. So one kind of fun, I think, way of thinking about gender in the media is the Bechdel Test. And this was developed by Alison Bechdel in 1985 to talk about movies particularly. And essentially, Alison Bechdel argued that to pass this particular test, a movie must contain one thing and one thing alone, basically just a scene in which two or more named female characters have a conversation, so back and forth dialogue, about anything at all besides men. So even if it's something that's very stereotypically female, like shoes and shopping, that doesn't really matter. Just all that matters is the fact that they have some kind of dialogue. So although that might sound really simple, a lot of movies, like more than you would expect, don't pass it. So it's something that doesn't really, come across in a huge amount of movies. So I think it's important to point out that not passing this particular test, which is quite arbitrary in a lot of ways, doesn't necessarily make a movie bad or unfeminist, just as passing it doesn't necessarily make a movie feminist. It's just a way of, it's a kind of just very simple exercise for thinking about how gender is represented in film, which is a particular type of media. So yeah, if you'd like to have a look at some films that that do and don't pass this particular test, I've put a list of kind of current and updated, so some more recent movies down the bottom here. But I think it's just a really interesting shorthand to think about, especially if we're considering how gender is represented in the media. Then something as simple as whether women have representation that's not centered around a male character and is based around women actually talking to each other is particularly interesting to think about. So continuing along this line, we can see, especially moving on from film to advertising, in a lot of advertising, we can see that the media validate and amplify and reinforce gendered behaviors, languages, and values as though these are completely normal, as though they represent a cultural norm. So we can see, for instance, that shame is a hugely powerful technique in advertising. So if you look at the PETA ad down here, it's trying to make a kind of animal rights claim or take a stance on animal rights and be anti-fur, but it's doing so by using kind of technique of body shame for women around pubic hair. So this generally sends a bit of a message that women are inherently flawed, and that advertisers, that women essentially need a certain product to be socially acceptable, to be liked by men, to be able to interact confidently and comfortably in the world. So I've linked to an article from the conversation here, which speaks a bit more about this, but there's a huge amount of examples of really regressive gender in advertising, really regressive representations of gender. And I think we're seeing this arguably less and less, but the kind of interesting thing about this type of advertising is that it's been so pervasive over recent decades because to some extent it works. Otherwise, if it was not a successful means of selling products, advertisers would not keep doing it. They're driven by a profit motive. So I think we can, as sociologists, we can ask some critical questions about why this might be the case, why sexualized and very kind of gender stereotypical and regressive advertising is successful, why people buy these products. We can see more examples here of stereotypes around women's roles as homemakers, as being cute, which is really infantilizing, and as being this horrible kind of nagging harpy. And these are all representations that come through really strongly, especially if you're making jokes about women. That's the type of things that are generally touched upon. So so we can look at, in terms of trying to move away from a view of media as something neutral and look at the ways in which it can reinforce and perpetuate inequalities in relation to things like gender, and especially taking a more kind of critical view on the media, we can move on to look at media news productions. So a lot of media claim that they are just reporting on the news, but we can question, is this the case? So one way in which we can kind of question, media news production and its so-called, neutrality or lack of neutrality is by looking at what is reported on and what is not reported on, what is deemed newsworthy. And generally, those who own and manage media would prefer or be more likely to report news that favors the interests of their own holdings and does not put forward very negative or damaging ideas around the people who own these particular companies. So, for instance, you would generally not find any criticism of anything related to Rupert Murdoch in Murdoch-owned media, and there's a very clear reason for that. But that's also, a way of illustrating that media are not necessarily just reporting the news if they have areas that they definitively will not report on. We can also think about the kind of criteria of newsworthiness, the need to make news interesting and notable and something that will, be watched by people. So a great example of this is current affair programs. Today Tonight and The Current Affair are the most overt and long-running examples of these. So they're always presenting these incredibly hyperbolic accounts of their subjects. They're trying to present them in a particularly bad light, and that's to fulfill these criteria of newsworthiness, to make an interesting story which is placed above and beyond the need or the imperative to just report on the news. News reporting is also constrained by its own format. So if we look at traditional media such as newspapers, we have large headlines. If we look at television reporting or even online promotion of stories through Twitter, they're based around sound bites. So, quick headlines, quick sentences, quick statements that are often use like simple sensationalist terms that can gain people's attention. So, a particular example of this would be how over the last couple of months, literally any place that is kind of patronized by a large amount of people, typically whether it's a school or a supermarket or a doctor's surgery or a park bench, has been described as a petri dish. That particular phrase is absolutely everywhere, and it's become a shorthand of describing like a vector of disease, this kind of phrase that instills a bit of fear and squeamishness. And that's come up in headlines absolutely everywhere. So we can think of the kind of reduction of simple terms that are used in news reporting that collapse a lot of complexity and are essentially just trying to draw in a potential listener, watcher, reader. So beyond just reporting on the news, we have the news or media trying to meet these increasingly kind of difficult criteria of newsworthiness and gain increasingly fragmented public attention. And coming back to the point around essentially news media being a little bit biased in its reporting in terms of in relation to who owns it and where its interests lie, we can look at news media ownership and who actually controls the sources of information in this country, which I think is a very interesting exercise. There's a helpful article on this which I've linked up here, but as well, just for a quick kind of snapshot of what this looks like, I put the link here, but essentially this particular chart shows us all of the news holdings that have more than a 5% market share. And so we can see that the news media in this country are owned by a relatively small amount of people, and it's quite common for one group or company to own several media outlets or to have a lot of very strong connections to each other. So if we're talking about a kind of ruling class and such in a conflict perspective, that can, I think, sometimes sound like a bit of a conspiratorial view of the world. But when we're talking about news media in this country, there is, perhaps a bit of concrete truth to this, or at least we could argue that perspective by looking at things like this chart and seeing where the ownership of the media actually lies. So, in summary of this section, mass media are popular primarily because they address everyday people at their own level, and they offer images and ideas that people identify with or perhaps reject. And they also work as a very powerful engine of marketing. But there's been a lot of changes to mass media in the past 10 years, especially the kind of convergence of old and new media. And now we have this new landscape that refers to these new forms of like social media, especially, as a real game changer within this. So I think I'll leave this section here for now, but in the final section of this lecture, I'll talk about media effects, which are essentially some theories of what all of this means and how we can understand the impact of the media on our everyday lives. So I will return to that in a moment. Thanks so much for listening.